right. Well, we move on to the modern roots of the Reformed approach. And so the modern roots of the Reformed apologetics are to be found in two streams of Reformed or Calvinist theology, the Scottish Calvinist and the Dutch Calvinist traditions. Very strong and pious people that wrote just a ton, and it seems like their minds work just on a wholly different level when you read some of this. So in Scotland, the stream of thought that is especially important for the rise of Reformed apologetics is known as the common sense realism, the key figure of which is Thomas Reid.
Right. And so Thomas Reid now, common sense realism, right? Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, right, is the time period he lived in. And so he was one of David Hume's most famous and important critics in his country of Scotland, right? So both of these guys were from there. According to Reid, Hume's skepticism was quite reasonable given the guiding principles of Hume's philosophy. So rather than to disprove Hume on his own terms, Reid sought to expose and refute the principles or underlying assumptions of his position. Right. And so his reasoning, Reid suggests, appears to me to be just there was therefore a necessity to call in question the principles upon which it was founded or to admit the conclusion.
Right.
Right. So either you admit the conclusion of Hume's ideas and arguments, right, because he's suggesting his reasoning seems to be good. So either you admit the conclusion, or you step back and you look at the principles upon which Hume's reasoning is founded, and you criticize those principles. So notice here we get a step back, and we might suggest this is kind of early presuppositionalism, right? We look at the basic principles that Hume founds his thinking on, his arguments on, and criticize those basic principles, instead of criticizing the conclusions of his arguments.
Right. So, that's what people like Craig will point to with the Kalam is here are two basic premises, and if you grant me these, then you have to grant me the conclusion. And so then people want to argue within that small little framework, and it seems to have issues or you levy your best attempt to show it not following the case. But what Reid is saying is let's step back and talk about those premises and where they were formed and what the foundation of it is on them, and then argue that they have no justification to be held, or that the reasoning there is specious to carry them through. All right, well, Reid identified the faulty principles underlying Hume's philosophy as rationalism, the belief that all knowledge had to be justified by reason or reasoning, including reasoning, right? The rationalistic premise has led Hume to question the possibility of knowing things that our senses and memories plainly tell us are so. In direct opposition to such varying forms of skepticism, Reid proposed a principle of credulity, namely that we ought to accept as true that which our mind, our senses, and our memories tell us is so, unless if we have good reason to disbelieve them. And when we get to people later in this chapter, Plantinga comes to mind, we'll kind of see this be carried over with some of his warranted belief.
Right. So notice he's suggesting here then that there's really no need to disbelieve our senses unless we have good reason to. So until we have good reason to disbelieve our senses, we should believe them, right? Until we have good reason to disbelieve our memories, then we should believe our memories. So notice this is, his kind of common sense approach here, right? So Reid's principle of credulity is closely related to the principle of, as I mentioned, common sense, certain principles which the constitution of our nature leads us to believe, and which we are under a necessity to take for granted in the common concerns of life without being able to give even a reason for. So we may not have a good reason to believe our memory, but common sense says we should believe it until we don't have a reason to believe it, right? So he kind of flips the question here. So
Yeah.
according to Reid, the validity of the principles of common sense is ultimately grounded. Now it's grounded in our creation by God. So common sense and reason have both one author, and of course, that is Almighty God. Mm-hmm. So why should we take this common sense approach? For the same reason that we take the approach of trusting our reason. They're both grounded in our creation by God.
Right. Good. All right. Well, as various scholars have pointed out, that does not mean that Reid thought one needed to believe in God in order to trust one's senses. In Reid's philosophy, belief in God provides a rational ground for belief in the reliability of one's senses. Again, if you're knowledgeable about presuppositionalism, a lot of this will start to sound really familiar, and we realize how few shoulders we tend to stand on, or how many shoulders we stand on here. Well, Reid then appears to stop just short of including belief in God among the principles of common sense. God's existence is, for Reid, the necessary presupposition of those principles, but not one of the principles themselves. Reid's own approach of defending belief in God and in the Christian revelation would fit fairly comfortably in either the classical or evidential apologetic tradition. So, he was almost there, almost. He favors the design or teleological arguments as principle of confirming the existence of God. So,
right.
All right. Well, he did a lot of work for us, so we can appreciate him for that.
That's right. So our book suggests and tells us that Reid's most distinctive argument for God's existence is the argument from other minds. So we're going to see this coming back with a vengeance in Atlantica, right?
Yeah.
We believe that the people we see around us have minds, Reid pointed out, even though, notice, we have no direct access to those minds, right? We can't see them, taste them, touch them, whatever Yet there is no good reason to doubt what we all know is true, namely that there are other minds. So notice again what he's doing here. Unless we have good reason to doubt it, we might as well take the common sense approach, right? So this is his principle of credulity, right? Unless we have a reason to doubt, then let's just go ahead and accept what our common sense tells us. Now, if we have good reason to doubt it, well, then, now we have to take another look. Mm-hmm. And so from this premise, Reid argues that if a man has the same rational evidence for the existence of a deity as he has for the existence of, his father or brother, his friend, that they have minds and that sort of thing, then he says, I apprehend this is sufficient to satisfy every man that has common sense.
Right. And he didn't live in 2024, so he had more confidence back then that his argument won out here. Well, because Reid employed the concept of common sense principles and held to that our senses, perception and memory should be assumed to correspond to reality and not be mere constructs of the mind, his epistemology became known as common sense realism. So common sense term for a common sense problem here. The approach to knowledge was to play a significant role in the apologetics of leading American evangelical seminary of the 19th century, Princeton. Yes, right. Princeton was once a staple of American theological minds. B.B. Warfield probably being the biggest one to come out of there, but a whole slew of people. The fundamentalism that people levy against you as a pejorative came from this. The writings, and it still has its theological wing in there, but the foundation was built on the Christian worldview, and is impressive to look at the history, and sadly the downfall. But it held off good hope against liberalism in the early 20th century there.
Exactly,
as well.
Right.